številu, v tem prelepem prostoru, v katerem sem zdaj prvič, ampak vidim, da gre očitno za neko staro zgradbo. To se pravi, da ima pač zgradba že sama po sebi neko atmosfero, ki je ustvarjalna, ki nas bo vzpodbudila in nam omogočila, da ta večer preživimo v prijetni družbi našega današnjega gosta. To je avstralski pesnik grškega porekla, Tom Petsinis. Program bo pač potekal tako, da bomo malo poslušali njegove pesmi, malo da bom jaz sprašal par stvari, na koncu boste imeli kakšno vprašanja, seveda ste dobrodošli. Zdaj bi pa kar
tudi... Lahko Iztok nekaj povem, da pa ne bi kar tako bilo. Gospod Iztok Osojnik je pesnik in gotovo ste dobili z vabilom nekaj podatkov o njem, tako da...
To sem tudi hotel omeniti. Najbolj ste dobili tele zloženke, ali kako se temu reče. V teh zloženkah seveda imate malo podatkov o našem gostu. V meni imate ene take, ki sem bil še dojenček, mislim. Drugač pa vse pesmi, ki jih bo pač Tom danes večer bral, so prevedene tukaj. Tako da bom jaz, ko bom prebral neko pesem, bom jaz povedal naslov v slovenščini, tako da si lahko pač pogledate, potem med tem, ko on bere, lahko sprot simultano berete prevod. Eno pištolo bi rabo, da to mu postrelim, mislim.
Spaj.
Enega spajderja. To je tak zadel pištolek. Tako da ne pusti, no, ne živi, se tu načinka, no, mislim, jaz sem se crte. Zdaj, za začetek vam bom prebral pesem z naslovom Svinčnik.
Pencil. Firstly, let me say two words in Slovenian. Dobrodošli, gosti. Kos? Okay.
Vodoma dve besedi v slovenščini, oziroma tri v angliščini, welcome dear guests.
Pencil.
Before you read it, it's like...
Silent at the bottom of your toolbox, red, black-edged, the rectangular stock, providing rough fingers a firmer grip. The once golden Columbia already faded, lead, flat, substantial for wood and brick, and last sharpened by a razor blade. Its length whittled to less than a third by crosses, numbers, lines, never words. Working, you wore it behind your ear that always blazed crimson with sunset. A man's best friend, you instructed. It marks and remembers. Keep it near. A lifetime later, and heeding your advice, I'm scribbling on concrete, drafting this.
Hvala. Tom Petsinis je avstralski pesnik, kot sem rekel, dramatik in romanopisec. Rojen je bil pa v Grčiji in je potem kot otrok emigriral v Avstralijo, kjer je študiral matematiko na univerzi v Melbournu. Nekaj časa je bil srednješolski učitelj, kasneje je opravil doktorat in zdaj dela kot profesor matematike na Victoria University v Melbournu. Izdal je 6 pesniških zbirk. My Father Tools, 4 Quarters, Naming the Number, Inheritance, Offerings, The Blossom Vendor. Je tudi avtor zbirke modelnih parabol, The Death of Pen, ter 3 romanov, The 12th Dialogue, The French Mathematician in Raising the Shadow. Kot literat bi lahko rekel, da je v duhu tega, da se je uredil recimo v Grčiji, pa se je preselil v Avstraliji in v duhu letošnje teme na Viljenici, ki je posvečena nomadstvu in nomadom, je tudi on, bi rekel, lahko en tak planetaren nomad, ogromno potuje in je bil udeležen na številnih mednarodnih festivalih. Tudi pri nas se je že mudil enkrat, je pa tudi avtor, ki je dobil kar precej mednarodnih literarnih nagrad. Zdaj, kot smo rekli, bomo tako nekako, jaz bi ga par stvari vprašal. In sicer iz te prve knjige, iz katere je prebral ravno kar to pesem, o svinčniku. V tej knjigi, to so tudi večinoma pesmi, ki jih mi imamo tukaj prevedene, gre za različna orodja in s pomočjo pesmi o teh orodij se on dotika dveh zadev. In zdaj bi ga rad vprašal, če mi lahko pač pove kaj več o tem. Po en stran gre za osebno zgodovino, očitno nagovarja, rečemo, pač neko familiarno zgodbo, zgodbo svojega očeta in preko tega svoje družine. Po drugi stran pa na ozadju te tematike zares poskuša obdelati še neko drugo temo.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Iztok. It's, firstly, thank you all for being here. It's great to be in Mariboru on this occasion of being the cultural capital of Europe. This is my second visit to Slovenia. My first one was some 10 years ago to the Življenje festival, and thank you for being here tonight. In relation to my father's tools, the book was inspired by the tools that belonged to my father, who passed away some 12 years ago. And the tools were put aside in the garage for a number of years until one afternoon I was wandering around and having a look in the garage, and the afternoon light was at a certain angle in the garage, and the light fell on the tools, and suddenly the tools took on a life of their own.
Spoštovane dame in gospodje, najprej najlepša hvala za takšen uvod in takšno predstavitev. Zelo vesel sem, da sem danes v Mariboru v okviru Evropske prestolnice kulture. Sem pa drugič v Sloveniji, ki sem jo prvič obiskal pred 10 leti. Zbirka, omenjena zbirka z naslovom My Father's Tools oziroma orodje mojega očeta se dejansko ukvarja z orodjem mojega očeta, ki je preminil pred nekje 12 leti. Ta orodja, o katerih sem kasneje pisal, so več let ležala v garaži. Potem sem jih pa nekega dne odkril in opazil, kako zanimiv žarek luči pada na nje.
The first poem that I wrote in the collection is features on the front cover, and it's a tool that is very specific to the Balkans. And the tool, as being born in Greece, I speak Greek and Macedonian, the Slavic language. And in Macedonian, my father would refer to this tool as a Tesla, which you may be familiar with the word, perhaps, a Tesla. And this was a tool that in many ways inspired the entire collection.
Prva pesem je naslovljena Teslo in gre za orodje, ki je bilo v osnovi inspiracija za celotno zbirko. Gre za orodje, ki je nekaj vrste specifično, izvirno za območje Balkana. Sam govorim grško in tudi makedonsko. In moj oče je omenjeno orodje v makedonščini tudi oznanjal kot tako kot Teslo oziroma Tesla.
When my father migrated to Australia in 1956, my grandfather said to him, "Son, you're going to distant Australia. You don't know what you're going to find there. Take this Tesla with you, put it in your suitcase, because you might find it useful in Australia."
Preden se je moj oče leta 1956 preselil v Avstralijo, mu je moj dedek, njegov oče, rekel: "Sine, vzemi to Teslo s seboj, greš daleč stran in morebiti ti bo nekega dne prišlo, kar se da prav."
So with this implement, with this Tesla, my father constructed the first kitchen table from bits and pieces of wood that he found here and there.
Torej, s tem orodjem, s tem teslom, je moj oče doma izdelal prvo kuhinjsko mizo in sicer iz reči, ki jih je našel tukaj in tam.
So with these tools, my father built a nest, if you like, for my mother and younger brother to join him. We joined him 3 years later in Australia, in Melbourne.
In s tem orodjem je moj oče ustvaril gnezdo za nas, torej tudi za mojo mamo, za mojega brata in zame. Mi pa smo se mu v Avstraliji pridružili 3 leta kasneje, sicer leta 1959.
As on the theme of the nomad, in some ways, yes, I do feel a bit of a nomad in that I was 6 when I arrived in Melbourne, knowing not a word of English. And at that age, of course, children pick up languages very quickly. So within a couple of months, I remember clearly interacting with some of the children on the street and picking up English words very quickly. And I think within 6 months, I was conversing, and within 6 months, I had 3 languages: the Greek, the Macedonian, and the English.
Kar pa se tiče nomadstva, na nek način se strinjam s tem, da sem nomad, saj sem se v Avstralijo priselil, ko mi je bilo 6 let. Ko sem prispel v Melbourne, angleščine še nisem znal govoriti, sem se pa kmalu naučil za voljo interakcije in druženja z otroci iz ulice. Tako po 6 mesecev potem, ko sem prispel v Avstralijo, sem štel 3 jezike, in sicer grščino, makedonščino ter angleščino.
If I could just share a memory with you of those days, I recall vividly being taken to school for the first time and being given an exercise book. And on the exercise book, on the front cover, I was just able to make out phonetically where you were supposed to write your name, your grade, and school. Now, I read these phonetically as neme, grede, school, which I translated in Macedonian, I don't want to come to school. So that was in many ways my first introduction to the playfulness of language, and I probably attribute my interest in poetry to those playfulness that exists between languages.
Pa še en spomin iz tistih dni, ko sem prvič prispel v Avstralijo. Spomnim se prvega šolskega dne, ko sem v roke prejel delovni zvezek in na prvi strani fonetično ugotovil, da moram napisati tja ime, razred in pa šolo. To sem fonetično, torej glasovno prebral kot neme grede šolo, kar v makedonščini pomeni nočem iti v šolo. Tukaj sem se prvič srečal za to igrivostjo jezika, kateri se v bistvu poklanjam tudi skozi svojo poezijo še danes.
Australia for us, we were in many ways displaced people. We'd come from the part of Greece that had been ravaged by the Second World War, and we were in many ways, I suppose, if not political, certainly economic refugees to Australia. And Australia provided a base, a solid foundation for us to be educated, for me to have English as my language of writing, and it provided opportunities for my children and subsequent generations. So even though we started the process as nomads, Australia has then enabled us to have the foundations to become accepted members of the Australian society.
V Avstralijo smo na nek način prispeli kot izseljenci in v bistvu skorajda kot prebežniki, in sicer kot ekonomski prebežniki, saj območje, s katerega smo se preselili v Avstralijo, bilo precej prizadeto za voljo druge svetovne vojne. Smo pa imeli srečo, da smo v Avstraliji našli trdno podlago, trdno osnovo za izobrazbo, za nadaljni razvoj, in na podlagi tega smo lahko več nudili tudi našim otrokom. Začeli smo na nek način kot nomadi, na srečo pa smo lahko našli trdne temelje, na katerih smo lahko rasli in pognali tudi korenine.
No, Tom.
Okay, now we'll stop into it.
I had to speak slowly, sorry. Predstavo si pač ta orodja, ki so ostala za svojim očetom, kot pač nek spomin oziroma neke simbole, ki govorijo o tej vaši zgodbi, kako ste se preselili v Avstralijo, kako ste se tam vzpostavili in to naprej. Ampak po drugi strani si mi pa prej povedal, da si te pesmi v teh orodjih v bistvu tudi uporabil zato, da bi upozoril pač na to ustvarjalno dimenzijo pesniškega jezika, ustvarjalnost in tako naprej.
Yes, the tools represent or work on a number of layers, one of which is, of course, the personal history of each tool, and the tools as a chronicle of the journey of migration and settlement into Australia on the first level.
Torej, orodja vsekakor so opisana v več plasteh. Prva plast je plast, z katere izžareva osebna zgodovina. Gre za neke vrste opis časa in dogodkov, povezanih z mojim prihodom v Avstralijo.
On the second level, they work to explore the relationship between a father and a son, and often the tension that exists between a father and the son wanting to grow up very quickly, and the father perhaps being a bit wary about this growing up too quickly. So that they explore that father-son relationship through interaction and through the place of the tool in that personal history between the two, the father and the son.
Druga plast pa se dotika odnosa med očetom in sinom, dotika se raziskovanja tega odnosa. Dogaja se, da prihaja večkrat do razprtij in do napetosti v tem odnosu, saj sinovi želimo večkrat prej odrasti in očeti na to gledajo z nekoliko večjim strahom leviti. Vsako orodje, katerega obdaja ustrezna simbolika, zaseda ustrezno mesto v tej zbirki in pripisano mu je tudi ustrezno mesto v zgodovini mojega odnosa z mojim očetom.
On the third level, the poems work as a metaphor for creation. The fact that tools are used for making things, for creating objects, for creating realities, I also wanted to use this as a metaphor for the creativity of the poetic process as well. The Greek word for poetry, poiesis, means to make, to create, basically through the physical, the material world. So these poems work as a metaphor for the creative urge to work with one's environment, to, if not to transcend the environment, at least to make the environment possibly more human and more hospitable.
Tretja plast pa je neke vrste metafora kreacije. Vsi vemo, da se orodje uporablja za kreiranje, za ustvarjanje, za delo reči, za ustvarjanje svetov, za ustvarjanje različnih reči, kot so pohištvo, naprimer. Kot metafora kreacije pa je ta plast uporabljena v pesniškem procesu in vpeta v pesniški proces. Pies, grška beseda, ki pomeni poezijo, vsekakor je usmerjena v kreacijo in pomeni kreacijo. V to plast pa sem vključil tudi kreativni žar, z namenom katerega bi skozi poezijo želel preseči neko okolje oziroma določeno okolje narediti bolj človeško, okolje bolj vredno, oziroma okolje, v katerem je človeku bolj vredno živeti.
Now, to go to tools of tools, da gremo zdaj k orodju vseh orodij, k matematiki. Pač po svoji profesiji si matematik, matematiko predavaš, matematika ti je velika inspiracija v pisanju, sploh ko gre za tvoje romane in za tvoje drame. Kakšen je ta odnos, rečemo, med matematiko in poezijo?
As I said, I very quickly became familiar with three languages upon arriving in Australia. It wasn't long before I acquired a fourth language, and that fourth language was mathematics. And I recall vividly when I was about 13, in high school, the high school teacher introduced us to Pythagoras' theorem. And I was struck by the fact that for any right-angled triangle, if you knew the lengths of two sides, you could almost by magic, by this formula, work out the length of the third side. And this impressed me greatly, and it sort of made for me mathematics almost like a mystical, it gave mathematics a mystical quality.
Kot rečeno, kmalu po prihodu v Avstralijo sem bil vešč govorjenja 3 jezikov, kmalu sem pa spoznal še 4. jezik, in sicer matematiko. Ko sem bil star 13 let, sem v srednji šoli spoznal Pitagora in Pitagorov izrek, s pomočjo katerega sem ugotovil, da lahko s pomočjo 2 hipotenuz izračunaš dolžino tretje. In to me je zelo fasciniralo. To je zame v matematiki oziroma iz matematike naredilo nekaj mističnega.
I've explored mathematics in various ways, partly because of the fascination with the metaphorical significance of mathematics and the ability to be able to draw from mathematical ideas correspondences to the human condition.
Matematika je za mene še toliko bolj fascinantna, saj na metaforičnem področju zame pomeni nek vir, kako lahko skozi njo potegnemo povezave do metaforičnih idej s človekom.
I've explored it through a novel called The French Mathematician, which was published some years ago by Penguin in Australia. And in this novel, I look at a young Frenchman from the 19th century, Évariste Galois, who at the age of 16 uncovered some fascinating mathematics. Unfortunately, it wasn't recognised in his time. He died in tragic circumstances at the age of 21, but his mathematics were subsequently discovered and found to have some very powerful applications.
Vplivnost matematike sem raziskoval v svojem romanu Francoski matematik, ki je pri Penguinu šel leta 1997. V delu sem se predvsej posvetil francoskemu matematiku Évaristu Galoisu, ki je že pri 16 letih dosegal en kopico zelo pomembnih dosežkov na področju matematike. Žal pa je umrl v zelo tragičnih okoliščinah, kljub temu pa se mu še vseeno pripisujejo zelo pomembni dosežki na področju matematike.
In this novel, I tried to steer away from approaching it from a traditional biographical look at the novel, in that I was approaching it as a novelist, and I decided to write it in the first person in order to try to convey the egocentric nature of this adolescent young man who was convinced that he had found something important and that he was misunderstood, and this interplay between what turned out to be his longing for order and the ensuing social chaos that was unfolding in Paris at the time. So this idea of order and chaos is in many ways what mathematics is trying to do, try to extract from the cosmos some sort of order, and that order is probably somehow embedded in the cosmos.
Omenjeni roman ni tradicionalna biografija. Lotil sem se ga kot pisatelj z namenom napisati roman in ga tudi pisal v prvi osebi. Gre pa za egocentričnost odraščajnika, ki je bil nad vse prepričan, da je odkril nekaj pomembnega. Vzpostaviti je želel red v času, v katerem je v Parizu vladal kaos. Torej gre tudi za neke vrste preplet med redom in kaosom. Kot vemo, matematika poskuša iz kozmosa, iz vesolja izvleci nek red in ga tudi izpostaviti. Dejstvo pa je, da matematika stremi za iskanjem reda v vesolju.
Maybe just one more reference to mathematics, and then we can go on and discuss some other things. But I've also explored mathematics for the stage, for theatre, in a play based on Hypatia of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century AD.
Torej še eno naveza na matematiko. Matematiko sem raziskoval in uporabil tudi v dramskih igrah, raziskoval jo za gledališče. in sicer v igri o Hipatiji, grškem matematiku, ki je živel v 4. stoletju. Se upravičujem, o Hipatiji, grški matematičarki, ki je živela v 4. stoletju pred našim štetjem.
What fascinated me about Hypatia was as a dramatist, tension is something that dramatists look to explore on the stage, and this idea of the tension between the emerging Christian religion in the 4th century AD and the, let's call it the Neo-Platonic school of thought that Hypatia belonged to, and this conflict between Bishop Cyril, who wanted to impose Christianity as the religion of Alexandria, and Hypatia, who lived in many ways the Platonic ideas as a religion, because for Plato, the ideal forms was a way of attaining unity with God, if you like, through mathematics in the first instance.
Pravi Hipatija je seveda živela v 4. stoletju našega štetja in kot dramatik sem želel v tej igri raziskati napetost med krščanstvom in idealom, katerim je pripadala in katere zastopala Hipatija. Predvsem njen boj z škofom, ki je takrat poskušal usiliti to krščanstvo na območju Aleksandrije, ter Hipatijo in njeno miselnostjo sama je stremela za platonskim idealom in sicer za idealom, ki je stremel za enotnostjo z Bogom.
Zdaj pa pesem Oblič.
Plain. There were rules and rituals for its proper use, like those that rigged the ship for the voyage south, loosening the central screw, rejigging parts, feeling the beveled blade with the moist thumb, and tightening again, making the many one. I'd watch it cruise over rough, weathered wood, like Mum's iron steaming flat my sea blue jeans, exposing flat, knotted reefs, treacherous rips, the strong undercurrents of opposing grain, renewing grey timber, smoothing all in its wake. I'd follow its forward surge, its swish and rush, collecting the curled shavings like crests of waves, which would race in gutters after the storm, or save to stoke Mum's copper on washing day, fascinated by how happily they flamed.
Če se zdaj vrnemo k literaturi, zdaj za nas seveda Avstralija precej delač, do neke mere poznamo seveda avstralsko literaturo, mogoče bolj tisto pol preteklo, zanima nas pa kakšna je zdaj recimo ta literarna scena v Avstraliji. Nasplošno literatura po svetu doživlja nekakšno recesijo, je malo marginalizirana, neke druge tendence, ekonomistične, finančne, pač prodirajo v spredje. Zdaj me pa zanima, kako se to v Avstraliji dogaja.
Well, like most countries, the economic turmoil of the last 3 or 4 years has impacted heavily on Australian publishers. Firstly, from the point of view that mainstream Australian publishers have shied away from publishing poetry. They feel that poetry doesn't generate any money for them, it doesn't make any money for the poets, so they've decided, no, we will not publish poetry. So poetry has been picked up by smaller independent publishing houses, because the big publishing houses in Australia, of course, are the multinationals. Penguin is owned by Pearson, and Pearson has got its tentacles all over the world, not only in books, but in all sorts of businesses. So from that point of view, the recession has impacted on writers, on poets and novelists.
Gospodarska kriza je udarila vsekakor tudi v Avstraliji in privedla do tega, da večji založniki naprimer ne objavljajo več poezije, zato ker so prepričani, da ni dobičkonosna. To so velike založbe, kot so Penguin in Pearson, ki si lasti več založb, ima pa svoje roke tudi na drugih področjih, so prišli do tega zaključka, tako da zdaj, če že izhajajo pesniške zbirke, sleherne objavljajo neodvisni, samostojni manjši založniki.
The sort of literature that Australia has developed in the last 20 years is very much a multicultural literature, and multiculturalism is in fact a policy that is promoted and supported by the federal government. To the extent that the Australia Council for the Arts does have a budget from the federal government in order to support writers. My visit here to Slovenia has been supported by the Australia Council, but the support is important in giving voice to the various ethnic groups that would possibly otherwise be marginalised in Australian literature.
V zadnjih 20 letih se je književnost v Avstraliji razvila predvsem na osnovi postulata večkulturnosti. Vlada namreč slednjo podpira. Svet za umetnost, Fundacija za umetnost z Avstralije, na primer, tudi financira tovrstne in drugačne akcije, financira na primer tudi obiske avstralskih avtorjev po svetu. Na podlagi tega sofinanciranja sem lahko tudi jaz danes vaš gost. Kar pa je dobro, to pravilo in ta zakon, pa je to, da dobijo tudi manjši narodi, ki so nadvse prisotni v Avstraliji, svojo besedo. Kolikor tega namreč ne bi bilo, bi morebiti nikoli ne slišali njihove zgodbe.
I think like the rest of the world at the moment, the nature of the digital revolution has affected Australia and impacted on Australia as it has here as well. And I'm finding that from one point of view, I think as a traditional author who sees the book as being the traditional way of expressing one's work, I think the digital revolution is probably giving voice to authors that perhaps would not have had the facility to have been published in a traditional way. So it is, in a sense, engendering a more democratic type of expression of the artistic temperament.
Digitalna revolucija je obšla v svet in vsekakor je obšla tudi Avstralijo. Sam sem tradicionalni pogleda in sicer avtor, ki so mnenja, da se literatura objavlja skozi knjigo, tiskano knjigo. Digitalna revolucija pa danes daje glas tudi mnogim, ki skozi tradicionalne medije verjetno sploh ne bi bili objavljeni, ne bi prišli do izraza. Z tega pogleda se mi zdi, da lahko govorimo o neke vrste demokratizaciji tega medija.
Some of the better known Australian writers, people like Les Murray, who's a very well known poet. I know he's visited many festivals throughout Europe. I'm not sure whether he's been to Slovenia yet, no, but people such as Les have got that democratic voice to on the one hand promote Australian literature, and on the other hand they've been very supportive of writers who would otherwise be marginalised. So there's this interaction between, let's say, the mainstream, the established Australian writer, and those who would probably otherwise be on the periphery. And Thomas Shapcott, another very well-known Australian writer who I know has travelled widely throughout Europe, he has also been very, very supportive of the, let's say, the other voice in Australian literature.
Eden najbolj znanih pisateljev sodobnosti, na primer Les Murray, ki se je udeležil že več festivalov po Evropi. On je nekdo, ki zastopa demokratični glas. On je tudi nekdo, kot je na primer Thomas Shapcott, še en znani avstralski literat, ki na eni strani promovira ta razvoj avstralske književnosti kot take, hkrati pa daje ta besedo tudi drugim. Podpirata tudi manj zastopane, nekoliko marginalizirane predstavnike, ki so kljub vsemu del območja in del te literature.
Za nas je seveda zelo zanimiv, pač kadarkoli govorimo o Avstraliji, vedno pomislimo tudi na aboriđine. Zdaj, aboriđini se v narekovajo umetniško izražajo, recimo skozi to svojo vizualno produkcijo, svoje sanjske zemljevide risajo. Zdaj me zanima, kako pa kaj njihova literatura, kako se njihova je, kakšna produkcija literarna z njihove strani in ima kakšen vpliv recimo na to splošno neko avstralsko, se pravi, ta njihov drugi glas, a je glas, ki odmeva znotraj Avstralije.
Yes. In the last 15 or 20 years, the voice of the indigenous Australian, the Aboriginal voice, has become far more prominent, and as we know, in many instances, the Aboriginal community did not have a voice. As recently as 1965 and 66, they couldn't vote. They didn't have a right to vote. But subsequently, the voice and federal government initiatives to embrace and to bring the Aboriginal community from the margins, and of course from the margins physically speaking, because they have lived in the centre of Australia, whereas most of Australia is settled on the seaboard, and with 80% of the population on the eastern states. So these initiatives to bring the Aboriginal voice and to through film, obviously through art and through literature as well. So in the last couple of years, Aboriginal authors have won prestigious literary prizes. The Miles Franklin Prize is the most famous prize. It was won by an Aboriginal writer 2 years ago. Aboriginal female writers are very active. The Aboriginal community is finally being supported to find its way into academia as well, and for many years there was not an Aboriginal academic. So with these initiatives, I think the presence of the Aboriginal in their rightful place which has been long overdue, is being recognised.
V zadnjih 15 do 20 let je glas aboriginov vse glasnejši, vse bolj prisoten v tem okolju. Le omenim do leta 1965-1966 aborigini, ki so dejansko domorodci, volilne pravice v Avstraliji sploh niso imeli. Skozi iniciative vlade aborigine pritegniti z obrobja pa v bistvu pomeni iz sredine države, torej iz centra, kjer se ničesar ne dogaja, saj večina avstralskega prebivalstva živi zunaj in sicer ob obalah. Z namenom in s pomočjo teh iniciativ je avstralski vladi uspelo jim pomagati na poti do pridobivanja njihovega dejanskega zasluženega mesta v avstralski družbi. Iniciative, ki so vodile do tega in jim pomagale do razkritosti, do vse večji prisotnosti in sodelovanja pri avstralski družbi, so sledile skozi film, umetnost in literaturo. Ena najpomembnejših avstralskih literarnih nagrad, na primer, je nagrada Miles Franklin, ki je pred 2 letoma prejel pisatelj aboriginskega porekla. Vse aktivnejše so pa tudi aboriginske pisateljice. Mnoga leta si sploh ne bi mogli misliti, naprimer, da bi aborigini tudi študirali in danes vse bolj vstopajo v akademijo. Njihovo polnopravno mesto je to, za čemer stremijo, in vlada jim k temu omogoča, aborigini pa se vse bolj trudijo, da ga bodo dejansko tudi čim prej zavzeli.
The Aboriginal community has always had a pivotal role, even though it hasn't been recognised in the arts until recent times. It's had a pivotal role in sport. In tennis, Yvonne Goolagong, of course, won the Wimbledon, back in the 70s. But in our Australian rules football, which is a code which is played specifically in Australia, Aboriginal players have been active and have been at the forefront of the game since the 1930s.
Aboriginska družba pa dejansko je že poprej zasedala pomembno mesto v avstralski družbi kot taki, ne sicer na področju umetnosti, bolj pa na področju športa, kot naprimer Gula Gom svoj čas, ki se je zoprstavljala še Mim Javšovec, to je z te generacije, v narodnem športu v Avstraliji, ki se pomenuje Aussie Rules Football, to pa je neke vrste kombinacija nogometa in rugbija, kamor mora žogo spraviti skozi dva velika droga. Tam pa so v spredju aboriginski igralci, veliki zvezdniki tega športa že od 1930 let.
Še eno vprašanje v zvezi s to avstralsko literarno sceno. Zanima me, če na univerzah imajo recimo programe, kjer poučujejo literaturo, se pravi pač ustvarjalne literarne delavnice. Recimo pri nas jih nimamo, pri nas imamo samo pač recimo katedro za obravnavanje literature, ni pa tudi ustvarjalna delavnica. Me zanima, kako je v avstralski univerzi.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good question, Iztok. The creative writing scene in Australian University is very active, very, very prominent, with great interest among students for these sorts of courses. For example, as well as teaching mathematics from time to time, I'm invited as a guest lecturer to teach creative writing at various universities.
Zelo dobro vprašanje. Kar se tiče kreativnega pisanja na univerzah v Avstraliji, je treba upozoriti, da je to zelo prisotno in zelo aktivno. Prav tako pa obisk strani študentov, kar se tiče tovrstnih delavnic, tudi zelo. Sam, na primer, na eni strani poučujem matematiko, sem na različne univerze tudi vabljen, da vodim delavnice kreativnega pisanja.
And these courses in creative writing, of course, can be taken at the undergraduate level, but there's the opportunity at most of Australian universities to do it as at the MA level or at PhD level as well.
Te delavnice je mogoče obiskovati v okviru diplomskega študija, kreativno pisanje kot tako, pa je mogoče upisati na magistrskem, pa tudi na doktorskem študiju.
And you might wonder, well, how can a novel qualify as an MA or as a PhD? The way these courses are structured is if the student is embarking on a PhD, say to write a novel, generally the formula is that the novel will be about between 60 and 80,000 words, and then the novel will be accompanied by an exegesis. And the exegesis is the theoretical framework, it's the references that the author uses, the inspiration that the author draws on in order to write the novel. So the two components together, the exegesis and the novel, are submitted for a PhD.
Torej pa spet vprašanje, kako na primer kreativno pisanje, pisanje nekega dela lahko nekoga kvalificira za magisterij ali pa doktorat. V tem primeru pa gre za slednje. Na eni strani se piše roman v okviru študija kreativnega pisanja, ki obsega od 60.000 do 80.000 besed, tega pa spremlja na drugi strani eksegeza, torej teoretični okvir reference, ubesedena inspiracija, ki je avtorico ali avtorja vodila do končnega izdelka. Do prejema naziva je tako treba predložiti roman, prav tako pa tudi teoretični okvir in zagovor tega na koncu vodi do naziva.
Sikl, sr.
Sickle. It waited in the long abandoned house, above the bread oven, bulging like a womb, left behind by youth gone overseas and death, now driving a diesel harvester. I rescued it, imagining your delight. Circumspect, you gripped the handle, worn bone smooth by sweat's abrasive salt, reaped a sheaf of sunlight angling in, felt the curve blunted by decades of disuse, but not with the touch I'd expected. You grimaced, using its Slavic name, almost whistling it between clenched teeth, as though that sharp three-letter word were made bitter from an absence of vowels, from its assonance with blood and death. Or at that moment, did you see again wheat fields stricken by unrelenting drought? Hear again cicadas hard at their song, taste that mix of warm vinegar and leeks, which never eased your hunger and thirst. You placed it on the kitchen bench, saying it was used to cut my umbilical cord. I thought of Mum, recently gone, labouring for each breath in her dying pain. You turned to the smell of burning toast.
Maybe a Charles. Killer.
Trowel. A morning of beginnings and dead ends. It's already noon and there's nothing to show. The shadow of a three-fingered pen caught by lines like the veins in my wrist. My frustration has sounded a dozen sheets. Others appreciate the music in this, doubled by tearing in halves, quarters, eighths, reducing me to a state of unletteredness. But I compose myself around your tools, recalling how this trowel slipped into cement, slapped, tapped in time, echoed like a bell in breaking solid reds cleanly in two. The wall of the veggie patch is done, 4 courses high, mortar defined, hardening. You're cleaning up, the taps whistling, the kite-shaped blade gleaming in the sun.
Če se za konec še recimo posvetimo malo deželi, v kateri se trenutno nahajaš, jaz vem, da imate v Avstraliji, imate tudi en festival, ki se v jami dogaja, tako kot pri nas Vilenica. Prvič si na Vilenico prišel 1999, zdaj smo 2012. Kako, recimo, primerjaš malo to situacijo, kako se počutiš v Sloveniji, kako jo doživljaš? Malo egoistično, tako, zdaj še malo. Vse več ugledalo pogledamo.
I've only been here a short time, so the impressions that I've absorbed are obviously possibly superficial, but I recall at the time on my first visit, I think Slovenia was looking to enter the European Union, and there was a sense of great excitement, anticipation. People were looking forward to what the European Union would bring. And for me at that time, I think this excitement of the possibility of what would unfold with the Union was what struck me at the time.
Tukaj, tokrat, tedaj nisem bil dolgo časa, pa zdaj sem tudi šele pred kratkim prispel. Vtis, ki sem ga dobil takrat, je bil nekoliko površen, nekoliko hiter. Tedaj Slovenija ob prvem obisku tukaj stremela za vstopom za EU. V zraku je prav dišalo po velikem pričakovanju ljudi, potem kaj bo EU prinesla narodu. In to je tedaj prevzelo tudi mene.
I'm surprised to hear, speaking to a number of people last night and this morning, that it seems as if Slovenia is finding itself in a difficult economic situation, which really surprised me because I really thought that Slovenia would be the country that would make the European transition very smoothly, because I've always known Slovenians to be a hard-working people, a people that are possibly more focused than the Mediterranean temperament. So when I'm hearing that the economic situation here is not as good as it should be, I'm very surprised by that.
Zelo pa sem bil presenečen po tem, kar sem izvedel med pogovori s kolegi včeraj in danes, in sicer, da tudi v Sloveniji vlada kar precej velika gospodarska kriza. To me je presenetilo predvsem zaradi tega, ker sem bil prepričan, da bo Slovenija prehod v Evropsko unijo dobro prestala, ker sem Slovence spoznal kot marljiv narod, vsekakor bolj osredotočen, kot so narodi, naprimer, Mediterana. Za voljo tega sem še toliko bolj presenečen slišati, kakšna je dejanska situacija danes.
And look, as a child back in Melbourne, when I was in primary school, I used to go to a shop that was owned by a Slovenian, not quite a butcher, more like a delicatessen, who used to sell salamis and hams and smoked ham, and we as boys would go there and we'd have a slice of bread, and the delicatessen, the Slovenian man, would put the slices in the bread, and we'd go off happily. And I always remember that shop with fondness, and how hard that Slovenian man worked to build up his little business. And look, I think that the present situation in Slovenia, I could only say that the example of that man's hard work, I think the hard work that Slovenians have put into the European experiment in the last 10 years, I'm only hopeful that you know, you will see through these difficult times and come out in fine shape.
That's true.
Kot otrok se na primer spomnim, ko sem še hodil v osnovno šolo v Melbournu, smo tam imeli delikateso, mesnino, ki je bila v lasti Slovenca, in z veseljem se spomnim, kako smo sošolci in otroci z ulice hodili tja po kos kruha s kosom salame. Tega lastnika, tega Slovenca se spomnim z veseljem, kakor tudi trgovine, spomnim pa se predvsem tega, kako je trdo garal, da je uspel. Verjamem pa, da bo slovenska marljivost in garanje Slovencev dejansko ta EU eksperiment čez čas pripeljalo tudi na pozitivni tir.
Še to me zanima, pač vprašanje v slovenski literaturi. Poznaš kaj te slovenske literature, oziroma je v Avstraliji recimo poznavanje, pa saj zavest o slovenski literaturi poznano, ki je glede na to, da je dosti Slovencev, tudi živijo v Avstraliji, ima kakšen vpliv, je prisotna.
Yes. I know there's a strong Slovenian community in Melbourne, and the Slovenian community has produced writers, and I've often, in looking at literary journals, I've come across poets and short story writers from a Slovenian background. How much is known of the Slovenian writing here in Australia? Possibly not that much. I personally know that, as I mentioned to Nina, the emphasis and the productivity of children's literature is very prevalent. I'm aware of that, and I was aware of that prior to coming to Slovenia. Of course, I've met Iztok in Struga some years ago. I'm aware of Istok's poetry as well. But I think, you know, the cooperation between Slovenia and Australia should be furthered. I think there is, or there was, in the university in Ljubljana, an academic who was working exclusively with Australian literature some years ago. I'm not sure whether he is still active in that area. So there has been some cooperation between the two countries on a literary level.
Slovenska skupnost je zelo močno prisotna predvsem v Melbournu in ob branju različnih literarnih revij v Avstraliji naletim tudi na pisatelje slovenskega porekla, predvsem pa pišejo poezijo in kratke zgodbe. V Avstraliji slovenski literarni kanon ni tako poznan. Po pogovoru z Nino danes sem slišal, da je veliko poudarka na otroški literaturi. Istoka, na primer, sem prvič srečal v Strugi v Makedoniji, tako da njegovo poezijo poznam. Sem pa mnenja, da bi vsekakor moralo biti na literarnem področju več sodelovanja med Avstralijo in Slovenijo. Spomnim se, da je pred leti akademik na Univerzi v Ljubljani predaval in se ukvarjal z študijem avstralske literature. Ne vem, če je temu še tako. Vsekakor pa bi si želel več sodelovanja med državami na tem področju.
Za konec bi te prosil, da prebereš še te pesmi Hammer, mislim, da je naslednja, Razcepno kladivo, pa še Dleto, Šizu. Kladivo, Razcepno kladivo je prva pesem, ki bo pobral.
Clawhammer. I served my apprenticeship in growing up, observing, always an arm's length from the job, pigeon quick in reacting to your call, determined to show I was no longer a child. They were days of hardwood, not pine, when you'd pick your ear with the nail's point, the wax of dark words soften steel, and hammer out a rhythm I knew by heart. Constrained at first, 3 steady taps, then harder, driving deeper, until halfway in, when you'd strike head to round head, each hit a signature of your unbending will. I practiced when you weren't at home, testing myself on the backyard bench and stool, the gate's impenetrable breadgum post, struggling to straighten what I couldn't direct. A son's apprentice to his father for life. That's why I'm finding new uses for these tools. Today, it's a gavel judging my work. Tomorrow, it's claws to extract my mistakes. Chisel. An extended metaphor long, it's more singular than the prime, divisible by nothing and one. A conduit for the moving mind, head silvered by experience, it channels the urge to create, converging to a tapered end that breaks rock, brick, concrete. Each impact spicing the air with approaching thunderstorms, adding to unnumbered stars, its rings celebrating from sea to sky, the marriage of idea and form, a wall 14 courses high.
Zdaj, jaz se našemu gostu Tomu Petsinisu zahvaljujem, seveda pa preden končamo, imate še vi priložnost, da se pozanimate v stvarih, ki vas zanimajo. Če imate kakšno vprašanje, prosim, le junaško na plan z njimi. Prepričan sem, da bo Tom z veseljem odgovoril na to vprašanje.
Mene zanima, kje on vidi vlogo literature v današnjih časih, v tem kaotičnem svetu? Kaj lahko literatura doprinese za izboljšanje sveta?
Well, literature does as literature has always done since the time of Homer. It firstly tries to define the human condition, essentially from the author's perspective, and through this definition of the human condition, it tries to build bridges. Language is essentially a bridge-building exercise when we communicate. So through literature, through exchange, through song, through dance, through the written word, we can only hope that barriers that might exist between people are overcome. And I think, yeah, look, I use the metaphor that language is a bridge. In the first instance, the poet or the writer writes for his or herself, but then the bridge must occur. That writing must transcend the personal to the other, and the other is, generally speaking, the other, and that's where let's say, the usefulness of literature comes in, even though I don't always subscribe to that literature should have a use, but if there is to be a use in literature, it's in building that bridge between I and you.
Ne tega čisto besedno vzeti, ne
Torej, književnost skuša že od Homerja opredeliti stanje človeka z vidika avtorja. In skozi literaturo, pesem, ples lahko upamo prebroditi ovire. Jezik je most in literatura v bistvu omogoča jeziku spostaviti trden most, zgraditi most, ki bo pomagal prebroditi ovire in povezati mene in vas.